green shirt, and he's got the green hat as well. But we're feeling very excited for this show today. I know that we've spent the past month filling you in with content on our website through articles, through YouTube videos, through any kinds of mediums that we can come up with. But today we kind of have a recap edition of the preseason. Today was our last time being on campus at the Woody Hayes Athletic Center with press conferences and with practice observations. Until next week, we'll be there and it'll just all be Texas prep. So this episode and today, we're going to be talking about some of our preseason camp standouts, some people that we heard talked a lot about the Woody Hayes Athletic Center, whether it was in press conferences or whether it was in the practices that we got to go see. And we'll also just talk about a few other observations that we were able to have over the course of the past month. But yeah, just kicking off conversation here, Dan, I'll kick it to you. Was there one player this preseason that you thought stood out for Ohio State? Somebody whose name you heard a lot, somebody who maybe stood out in the first couple of practices that we saw this fall?
Well, I want to say, first of all, I'm just glad that we were actually able to successfully go live on the right video this time. We've struggled with that in our first few attempts, so we're off to a better start here. Hopefully, we can keep it going here for a strong show. But, you asked me that question. I mean, the guy's name that's just hard not to bring up is Austin Siereveld. I mean, you just think about where he was at the end of last year. I mean, he was a backup guard. He got demoted in the college football playoff. He started the college football playoff as a starting guard. Luke Montgomery took his place. He still rotated in there with Tegra Shabola at right guard in the last couple of games of the CFP run. But this is a guy who's a backup guard. Then you go into the start of spring practice. It's like, okay, maybe he'll be a starter somewhere on the line, but you're thinking the starting tackles are going to be Ethan Onionwa and Phillip Daniels. Then you see Austin Siereveld getting all these first team reps, and it's like, okay, maybe he's going to be one of the starting tackles. Ryan Day comes out at the end of spring practice and said Austin Siereveld is going to be a starter for our offensive line this year, which makes it very clear how highly Ohio State thinks of him. Then a week into preseason camp, all of a sudden, Austin Siereveld's the starting left tackle. He had been at right tackle those first few practices at camp. They move him to left tackle after a few days. Now, you go back to Monday, Ryan Day didn't want to really name any starters other than Julian Sain at quarterback, but he did name Austin Siereveld as the starting left tackle. I think all of that just speaks to how much this guy's stock has just gone up like this the entire offseason. And this is a guy that they are now counting on. He was a backup guard last year. They're now counting on him to be the anchor of Ohio State's offensive line. And there's maybe a little bit of concern that goes with that. Like, this is a guy who's never played tackle, and now he's your starting left tackle. But the way everybody's talking about him really makes me think they really believe Austin Siereveld can get the job done. I don't think this is oh, we got no other options. We got to throw Austin out there. I think it's no, they really think Austin Siereveld is going to be a great tackle for Ohio State's offensive line. And so I'm excited to see what it looks like. I mean, he's going to get thrown right into the fire against Colin Simmons and those Texas defensive ends in game one, and I'm excited to see how he holds up.
Andy, who is your standout from preseason?
Honestly, it's Arvell Reese. You just look at photos of this guy. I put it in a story earlier this camp. He's the dudesiest dude that ever appeared in Dudes of the Week. That post that Ohio State had put up regularly in the summer, Dudes of the Week. And he's there. And anytime you see a picture of him, he just looks sculpted out of bronze like a Hulk, really. And he makes some of Ohio State's defensive linemen look small. He's that muscular right now. And the athleticism is there. We saw it last year. The few practices we got to see, he showed some flashes there too, I think. But mainly it's just that physical change, and hearing James Laurinaitis talk about him too, and how he called him freakish for his violence and for his, again, that athleticism he has, the length, the ability to challenge passes when you're that tall. Both he and Sonny Styles are 6'4" and able to challenge passes that way. The strength, the speed. He has a nose for the ball, and I think that even, like I said, showed last year when you talk about 43 tackles. I'm really excited to see what Arvell Reese is this year and what they do with him, because I think there's a lot of ways you can get creative in the scheme, whether it's bringing in Peyton Pierce and running a 4-3, or an odd one idea I really like is you have an odd front where you give Arvell a chance to rush off the edge. I mean, he came in and his freshman season, he spent some time at defensive end. I think he clearly has that in his arsenal now. Ohio State already has a converted linebacker playing defensive end who is that sort of similar body type and a supreme athlete in CJ Hicks. But I think Arvell Reese is going to be on the field, close to every snap defensively. I think there are opportunities to use him in creative ways. And I also think that speed creates good matchups with tight ends and is why maybe you could see more 4-3 looks, both he and Sonny, who has that experience playing safety from Ohio State this year, especially against teams that are going to run 12 personnel and the like. Um, and I think Matt Patricia is a great defensive coordinator to utilize him in exactly those scenarios. Arvell Reese touched on that when we spoke to him earlier this preseason camp, said that he loves how Matt Patricia has let him play free, let him see some different things without giving too much away about different ways he might be used. But in terms of physical freaks on this team, Arvell Reese is among the upper echelon, and I think he could be a superstar this year.
Absolutely. I think, I kind of posted this as a joke a little bit, but it was before preseason camp even started. I tweeted out a picture of 4 separate Ohio State players and named them to the all swole team. Ohio State had sent us those headshots from media day, and somebody had commented the 4 players were Arvell Reese, Sonny Styles, Jeremiah Smith, and then Garrett Stover. And somebody had said that Ohio State is the only place where linebackers look like defensive ends and wide receivers look like linebackers, or you can say it in any order you want. But I just thought that was a very funny comment to be made because it's true. I mean, you look at Jeremiah Smith, you're like, this dude could line up at middle linebacker. You look at Arvell Reese, you're like, this guy could line up at defensive end. But with defensive end, that's where I go for preseason standout. Kenyatta Jackson Jr. is kind of the name that I've been hearing a lot when we've been down at the Woody Hayes Athletic Center for press conferences. And he's somebody that I appreciated how candid he was in his remarks to us when we spoke to him about his journey at Ohio State a couple of years ago. People always were throwing out his name as somebody who could be a transfer candidate. He wasn't getting the playing time that many people thought he should get. Obviously, that there was JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer in front of him, so it's hard to say that he should have been getting more reps than those two with how dominant that pair was as a defensive end combo. But Kenyatta waited his turn, and he spoke in his press conference with us most recently that he didn't really want to be a leader on this team. He saw what JT and Jack were able to be as leaders, and he didn't feel worthy of being in the same conversation as them. And he said that there were times during winter workouts where Larry Johnson and especially Coach Mick were so hard on him that he would go home from practice in tears, thinking, I don't know if I'm cut out for this. But he responded in such a way that was inspiring. He was one of the, I believe it was somewhere between 8 and 10 Iron Buckeyes from this past summer, which he wasn't that in the winter. It was just Jeremiah, Sonny, and then Austin Sierraveld, Dan's pick. But then Kenyatta responded and he said, I'm going to be an Iron Buckeye. I want to be a captain. He gets both of those honors. And this team really looks up to him as somebody that is a leader. This is something that has been a work in progress for a long, long time. And I think that Kenyatta deserves all the flowers he's getting. Hopefully this will then lead into a season that he can continue building on the success that he's had this offseason. I do want to ask you guys too, there's a standout. Is there any name that you guys have maybe been thinking about hasn't been getting the attention that maybe they deserve, or maybe they're flying a little bit under the radar? Have you guys had any thoughts about that?
That's a good question. I think a guy that, Andy would probably agree with me on this one because we've talked about him a little bit before. A guy who I think has the potential to be a breakout star for this Ohio State defense that I don't think we've really been talking that much about recently is Jermaine Matthews Jr. I think going back to the spring, I think he was one of the biggest standouts in the spring. And I think he's kind of in this weird spot where it's like, he played enough last year where he's like sort of considered a returning starter. So like, he doesn't maybe get talked about as much in like the breakout category as say an Arvell Reese or a Kenyatta Jackson or an Austin Sierraveld, but he is still going to be a first-time starter. And I think he's a guy that based on what we were able to see in the open practices we were able to watch, I think he has a potential to be one of the best cornerbacks in the country. I think Davison Igbinosun has that too. And you could throw his name in there as well as another guy. I mean, we talk about like the returning stars on his team. There's a lot of talk about Jeremiah and Caleb and Sonny Styles and Carnell Tate. Davison doesn't get talked about as much. I mean, he's the most experienced returning player on the team. He's going into his 3rd year as a starter at Ohio State, his 4th year as a starter at the collegiate level. So I think Ohio State has the potential to have an elite tandem of outside cornerbacks. And I don't know if that's been talked about as much as it should be.
Yeah, I think Davison, and he was another one of those guys that spoke very candidly about some of the problems that he's encountered throughout his Ohio State career. Not so much off the field stuff, Dan, but I know that he mentioned he's very aware that he needs to cut down on his penalties this fall. And that's something that he's working on. He said the biggest issue that he needs to correct is just turning his head around and playing the ball. And he also, too, when Tim Walton talks about him, he has to understand that the referees understand that he has a reputation coming into the games, that he is a guy that likes to play physical. He's a guy that likes to create contact at several different levels. And so referees are looking for that kind of stuff. But he seems like he's spent the entire offseason aware of that is something that he needs to correct, and that he's made the changes necessary to improve in that area. And he also said, too, that he wants to be a first-round draft pick. He's very open and honest that that's his goal this season, in addition to the team goals, but he wants to be a first-round draft pick. And in developing into that, especially in the NFL, is that pass interference penalties are a spot penalty. So unless you're clean in your coverage, teams are just going to pick on you all day. And especially if you're a first-round pick, you got to be someone that they can rely on and count on to be someone that's not going to commit penalties at each opportunity. Andy, who is somebody that you would pick as someone that's flying under the radar this preseason?
I think one guy that's kind of gotten lost, and this is partially my fault, I think, because we've talked about Caleb Downs playing nickel a lot. We've talked about the strong safety competition a lot. But I was really impressed with Lorenzo Styles Jr. in the spring. I think it's still, to me, I still expect him to get the majority of nickel snaps. And that position is still so important to this defense. All you have to do, providing run support, playing in space and covering slot receivers, like it's a very demanding position in football in general that has become more and more important over the years. It's not that I necessarily expect him to be, as bright a star as Caleb Downs or anything, but he's a really important player in the defense, I think. And I've seen enough from him this offseason, the times we've gotten to watch him, to have faith that he can actually hold up in those settings. Again, especially in the spring game seemed to be really sticky in coverage, seemed to really challenge a lot of passes. Talking about Lorenzo, talking to anyone about Lorenzo, talking to Lorenzo, this is a guy that's as confident as anyone on the team. He believes in himself, and I think that is vital as a defensive back. Davison Igbinosun and Jermaine Matthews Jr., a lot of the other corners have had quotes about this. It's one of the toughest positions to play in football. It's a position where you've got to have a short memory, and it's a position where you're remembered much more for your mistakes than your successes. And so to play a position like that, you need to have undying confidence in yourself that if I get beat at some point, which is inevitable, I'm going to respawn the next play and shut down my opponent, my assignment, whatever's given to me. So the confidence, he's always had good physical traits. I mean, he has good length of the position. There's a guy who played receiver at Notre Dame, obviously, now in his 3rd year since switching. And that's a position change that takes a lot of time. It's not like moving from guard to tackle on the offensive line. Yes, that's demanding in a switch, but corner is so technical too. And it's much different than playing receiver, of course. I think it really took time for him to mold into that and refine those elements. He got some experience last year when they ran dime packages. I think Lorenzo Styles Jr. can be that steady nickel where you don't talk too much about him, but it's a good thing you don't talk too much about him for Ohio State.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another guy that you probably would hear his name, but you might not talk about him that much would be my pick, and that's Peyton Pierce. I think every time James Laurinaitis talks about Peyton Pierce, he lights up. He gets really excited.
He reminds him of himself.
Exactly. It's a great comparison as well. I mean, you think about Peyton Pierce's wrestling background helping him on the football field. It feels like every time that we talk with everyone that's not Peyton Pierce, because he's a humble guy, and I don't think he would give himself this title. But they say he's the best tackler on the team. If you want a guy that's going to hit the hole hard and that's going to take down a running back, that's going to take down a wide receiver coming through the backfield in motion, it's going to be Peyton Pierce. That dude has a nose for the football, and that dude's going to hop on some piles when he can. And I think that's somebody, him, and then in addition to him, Riley Pettijohn has been a name, that a freshman that's come along nicely. James Laurinaitis was saying, he might not see the field on defense against a team like Texas, but they definitely want him to make an impact early on special teams. And I think he's certainly going to be one of the first reserves coming off the bench when Ohio State's playing Grambling in Ohio. I think James Laurinaitis' room, as we've known for years, given Jim Knowles' system with just 2 linebackers, it's really hard to carve a role for yourself in that room because there's only 2 guys that are going to be on the field primarily. But when you have Matt Patricia coming in and all the experience he has at the NFL and showing a bunch of different looks, Andy, you mentioned this earlier with Arvell. Could they explore moving him around in different places that can keep the quarterback guessing, keep the opposing offense guessing? I'm curious how many times Ohio State will choose or elect to bring on 3 linebackers to bring a guy like Pierce or like Pettijohn onto the field. Also, too, as you mentioned, could they bring Caleb Downs closer to the line of scrimmage and explore ways to bring him into different spots of the field? But yeah, Peyton Pierce, I think, is a great pick because I think he's somebody that Ohio State fans are going to hear his name early and often. I know that he has, being a Texas guy, some extra motivation to play the Longhorns in week 1. As we move forward, I know we've talked about standouts. We've talked about guys flying under the radar. Were there any other observations from this past month with press conferences that we've had with Ryan Day, the coordinators, any of the position coaches that you guys have talked about, maybe some developments as we head into Texas week and we kind of wrap up our preseason camp coverage, or anything that 11 Warriors readers need to know at the top of their news board right now?
Well, I mean, certainly, we can only go so long without talking about Julian Sayin, right? I mean, he's
right.
Was just named the starting quarterback for Ohio State 2 days ago. So, I feel like we got to talk a little bit about Julian Sayin as Ohio State starting quarterback. And, there does seem to be a good amount of confidence around the team in Julian's ability. Talking to some of the tight ends today, they talked about him, having a good presence, having a good command, which I think to me is one of the bigger questions of Julian. I think we know Julian has the natural arm talent, the natural passing ability. He's had that since high school. I think the big question for me with Julian 10 days from now is, okay, how's he going to handle it the first time he gets hit hard? How's he going to handle it the first time he makes a mistake with 105,000+ people watching him in the shoe? That's what we really don't know yet about Julian, is how's he going to respond when adversity hits in the game. And, hearing the way that, Ryan Day and Brian Hartline and Matt Patricia all talked about him on Monday, I think there were certainly positive indicators in what they had to say about Julian. You heard Matt Patricia talk about the way Julian sees the field being something that really impressed him. I think that's something that I think maybe in the spring, I didn't necessarily feel like we were seeing that from Julian. So if what Matt Patricia is saying is true, that's again, we only got to see the first 3 practices. So we're at that point now where it's hard because we're going off of what we've heard for 2.5 weeks, but we haven't really got to see anything with our own eyes. We won't get to see anything more with our own eyes until they actually are playing Texas in 10 days. So we're kind of going off of what we hear and trying to take stock in that and, take it for at its word. But, we heard, the words that came up a lot when the coaches were talking about Julian Sayin on Monday were, composure, taking care of a football, seeing the field. I mean, we've heard Ryan Day say it over and over again, like when it comes to that quarterback position, like the number one thing he prioritizes is you got to take care of a football. You can't be out there, making mistakes, being careless of the ball. Again, it's different in practice than it is under the bright lights when you got a live rush coming at you. So we're not going to really know exactly what Ohio State has in Julian Sayin until that game in 10 days. But, it does feel like there's at least a decent level of comfort around the Woody Hayes Athletic Center right now in Julian. He's their guy. They've committed to him being their guy for the Texas game. And now we got to see how it plays out.
You see it under the bright lights. The brightest of lights is the sun, which is what Ohio State and Texas will be playing under at high noon. It'll also be blinding all three of us in the press box while we're trying to watch the game.
Oh,
So we'll
don't
do
remind me. I'm gonna
we'll,
be burning.
we'll
Jeez.
we'll do our best to keep our observations close to the field as we try our best to also see the players as they're running around. But Andy, yeah, any thoughts on Julian Sayin and obviously Ohio State's decision to name him the starting quarterback, but then also what some of his teammates and coaches have said about him since he was officially named QB1?
I think Dan mostly hit the nail on the head. I think what Matt Patricia said about him right after he won the starting job when we talked to Matt Patricia, like literally the same press conference, right, was his processing has stood out, his ability to digest and take what defenses throw at him. And that has been one of my main questions with Julian is how is the ability to read and react to defenses and make the right decisions and have the right timing. In terms of actually throwing the ball, he's got one of the quickest, smoothest releases I've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
He is accurate on air, very accurate on air, a lot of zip on it. Like Dan said, he's got all that talent. It's just there's so much more that goes into playing quarterback than actually just being able to throw the ball well. Again, timing up those routes, knowing where to go based on what a defense is giving you. I know a lot of fans saw what he did in the spring game and that performance there and assumed he would just run away with the competition after that. Ohio State was playing two defenses in that game. He had very easy reads and decisions to make. Now you're getting all these things thrown at you, and I'm sure they've thrown a lot at him and Lincoln Keenholz in preseason camp throughout this competition to see how they respond. To hear that from Matt Patricia is encouraging. Now, we'll see against Texas that's going to be different, right? When you're actually in that fire, 105,000 screaming fans, all of that. I think it's different when you're actually seeing it live in a defense that's actively trying to quell you. Texas has a really, really good defense this year. So that is my main question still with Julian, but it was encouraging what Matt Patricia said on Monday.
Yeah, it seems like no matter who you talk to, everyone always mentions the spin. The way that the ball spins when Julian Sayin throws it, he can make every throw. I thought Tim Walton's comments just yesterday on Tuesday when we were at the Woody was telling of the way that Julian has commanded the offense, particularly in the past 2 weeks. Walton was saying that Sayin has challenged the defense at pretty much every level because he can make throws in the short and the intermediate and the deep ball. And it helps when you have guys like Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate and Brandon Inniss to catch those passes. You don't really have to be the most accurate quarterback in the world when you have guys like that who are catching the football.
Max Clare, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And Max Clare was somebody we talked to today as well, who was saying that Julian Sayin can lead the offense and can make the throws to keep the chains moving. When we talk about what Ohio Stadium will look like going into next week, I did think that your comment, Dan, was particularly a good one because the last time that we've really seen Julian Sayin with an extended period of playing time in a regular season game, a game of consequence, was the Western Michigan game last year, where he had I guess really was what his longest completion and one of his only completions last season.
It accounted for more yards than the rest of his passes.
Yeah.
So,
and
yes.
it was that 50+ yard touchdown pass to Bennett Christian. Outside of that, we just really haven't seen him in any game action. And I should say, too, that came in late in the game when there was probably only, what would you guess, 40, 50, 60,000 people still left in the stadium. Now, those who watched the play got excited and that they were cheerful and that everything was great. But that's a big difference between Ohio State's up 50 points against Western Michigan in the second half and the first offensive drive in the horseshoe against the number one team in the country. So I guess that will be something that we'll have to monitor going into next week. And I'm curious to see how exactly Ohio State creates a game plan around getting Julian Sayin comfortable while also helping him move the chains. Does Ryan Day...
I remember getting a lot of comments after that play of why is Devin Brown playing before Julian Sayin? And maybe those people were onto something because, I mean, Devin Brown was just named the second string quarterback at Cal, and Julian Sayin is now the starting quarterback at Ohio State.
Right. And unfortunately, Devin Brown is probably not going to have a future or much of a future at Cal, considering that the quarterback who's starting in front of him is going to be a freshman. So it'll be interesting to see where Devin Brown ends up next after that as well. We do
Only
have
one year left after this year. Yeah.
we do have a question coming in from our YouTube chat, and I think it's a good one. It's coming from Josh, actually. Josh Beloa, Go 11 Warriors staff member. He's asking which freshman will make the biggest impact this season. I think there might be an obvious choice here, so one of you guys can scrap over it. But who do you think is going to be the freshman that can make the biggest impact?
Dan can have the obvious.
I was fully expecting the question to be about Medina's own Brennan Schramm. That said, Andy, you go ahead.
I'll go ahead. Okay, I'll take the less obvious one, and that's Bo Jackson. We heard Ryan Day say on Monday that Ohio State feels there are three players at running back they feel confident putting in the game, not just two. And everything we've seen from Bo Jackson this offseason, the spring he was even impressive the few fall camp practices we got to see. I expect him to have some action in the games. I don't expect an even split between James Peoples, and CJ Donaldson, but this is a dude with a different kind of burst. When you watch him, the way he accelerates through the line of scrimmage, it's just different. He's got that speed. It's like the 1980s Bo Jackson, the speed. Maybe not as strong through the thighs, but I really love Bo Jackson's game, and just anytime you can get him going on the outside, it can be an explosive play. I think you want to develop him a little more between the tackles, although he does still already have some of that. Before he's going to be the full-time running back or working in full tandem with others. But I do expect him to see the field and get meaningful reps this season. And I think Day's comment on Monday really reinforced that belief for me. I think he's honestly too good to keep off the field, much like the other guy might be that I'm sure Dan's about to talk about.
Well, I assume you guys are hinting at Devin Sanchez, but we'll see with Devin Sanchez. I mean, I talked about it earlier. Jermaine Matthews Jr., Davison Igbinosun could be two of the best corners in the country. So I think we will see some Devin Sanchez, but I honestly think like right now, if I think about like who's a freshman who maybe has an opening to make a major impact this year, I'd go Jarquez Carter, because we know the defensive tackle depth is still a big question mark on this team. There's some injury questions right now at the pre-tech position. Edric Houston coming off the injury he suffered on the first day of camp. Andy, you noticed Jason Moore walking off the field in a walking boot on Wednesday. And so there's some question marks there about the depth at pre-tech, and that could open the door for Jarquez Carter to play a major role as early as week one. They might need Jarquez Carter to be a guy who can come in and play as a freshman at defensive tackle. And I thought it was very telling when Larry Johnson was talking about the defensive tackles last week. And the first two names he mentioned were Caden McDonald and Edric Houston. You'd expect that. The third name he mentioned was Jarquez Carter. So what can Ohio State really expect from Jarquez Carter 10 days from now? That's uncertain. I mean, he hasn't even lost his black stripe yet. So, there's clearly still some things that he needs to do to prove that he's ready to play and make a big impact for Ohio State this season. But when I just think about the depth chart and I think about where opportunity could be, I think Jarquez Carter might be the guy. Bo Jackson certainly in that conversation as well. But Jarquez Carter might be the guy. Like, if you think about a freshman who they might actually need to produce for them this year, Jarquez Carter might be that guy.
All right, twist my arm. I'll take Devin Sanchez. I didn't think I'd get him with a third pick, but here I go, Devin Sanchez. But no, obviously Dan explained where Devin Sanchez could make an impact this season. Got another question coming in from Shadrach Bell. He asked, who's the best overall running back coming out of camp?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I noticed that I think Ohio State alum Jonathan Wells asked us about the running back room over on Facebook as well. So thank you for listening in, Jonathan. I think it's really close at running back right now between James Peoples and CJ Donaldson. And that's not a bad thing, because we saw last year you had two running backs who were fairly equal to each other, very different skill sets, but fairly equal to each other in terms of stature, in Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. And what did that result in? In the college football playoff, both those guys were fresh and they played their best football of the year. So I think the hope very much for Carlos Loughlin and Ohio State is that you have a very similar dynamic this year with James Peoples, with CJ Donaldson, possibly including Bo Jackson in that mix as well, to where you're not riding anybody for 20, 25 carries a game. You're mixing guys in, you're getting good production from all of them, and you can keep them fresh over the course of a year. Now, that's not guaranteed. I do think, like, if you're talking ceiling for this year, I think Andy and I would both agree that I think James Peoples is probably the guy who has the highest ceiling for this year, at least. I think James Peoples is a guy who you could see making that big jump from year 1 to year 2 and becoming a star on the offense. And, let's say that happens and CJ produces at the same level he did at West Virginia, then maybe a heavier lean starts to go towards James Peoples, at least in those big games. I think you're playing Grambling and Ohio and Rutgers and whatnot. You're definitely going to try to mix up the carries. And that might be where we see more of Bo Jackson than we will against Texas and Penn State and Michigan. But I think ideally you'd like to have at least 2 guys, splitting the carries fairly evenly. But I certainly don't rule out the possibility that James Peoples could emerge as, the clear number 1 back, and you need to give him a little bit higher volume of carries in those big games. I do think right now, like, if I was to answer that question directly, who is the best running back coming out of camp, I would lean towards James Peoples. But I also think CJ Donaldson's had a really good offseason. I think he's changed his body. I think they like what they've seen from him in terms of him running with some more speed than maybe he did at West Virginia. And so I'm high on CJ Donaldson too. I don't think either of these guys is going to be Travion Henderson. I think, Travion, but we're seeing it in the NFL right now, what he's doing with the New England Patriots. Travion had that unique just burst and explosiveness that I don't know that anybody in this room quite has. Maybe Turbo Rogers down the line. I think Travion was a special talent in that way, but I do think that this can still be a very good running back group.
Yeah, just going off that, to your point, I think the 12-team playoff brought the de facto end of the era of featured running backs at Ohio State, in the sense that you have one guy who's a workhorse who's going to eat 80% of the carries in the running back room, and then there's one, some people might support him there. But I'm expect going forward in the future, it's going to consistently be like this for Ohio State under Ryan Day, under Carlos Lachlan, who constantly never wants to establish who his top backs are. Everyone's always competing with each other in Carlos Lachlan's room. Whenever we speak to him, that's what he says. Nothing wrong with that. I understand instilling that mentality in your players. As a reporter, though, it can get a little, it's like, I just want to know, come on. We know Isaiah West isn't going to get the same number of carries as James Peoples, man. Anyway, yes, James Peoples is my pick. I believe it was Travion who referred to him as a mini J.K. Dobbins. Both guys are from Texas. I think it's a great comparison for his skill set, the shiftiness. I love his sort of one-cut ability, especially in the spread scheme that you're running at Ohio State. Can really take advantage of those sorts of zone plays where, again, you stick your foot in the ground, you make a read of the blocks, and you go. I think that's very much fits with James Peoples' style, but he's also, I think, got a little more burst comparing him to CJ Donaldson, where Donaldson is seen as more of the power back. I also love, both guys have a fantastic mentality. They posted a mic'd up of James Peoples, Ohio State did yesterday, and he picked up Sonny Styles on one of the most clinical pass protection snaps that I've seen from a running back this offseason for Ohio State, similar to what Travion did for them last year and how excellent he was in pass protection. And that just tells you it's a guy that's willing to sacrifice his body and lay it on the line for the team. Again, not that other running backs in the room don't also have that, but I think James Peoples, when I look at the fine details of some of the things at the running back position, and I'm sure if we had Jonathan Wells on here, he could break it down even much better than I can. But to me, James Peoples, again, has that higher ceiling, like Dan said, and I expect a big season from him.
One last thing I'll add about Peoples is that Ohio State, as we kind of went into last season, I think Ohio State's one of their question marks was running back depth. Then they obviously add Quinshon Judkins out of the transfer portal, and all of those questions are then erased. But we did have Maurice Clarett on for one of our 12th Warrior happy hours, and Maurice was very forward by saying that James Peoples could have been Ohio State's running back too last year behind Travion Henderson. And maybe even if Henderson weren't there, he would have been confident in James Peoples' ability to carry the load in the running back room as a true freshman. Now you get him with a year of development as a guy who can lead the running back room next to a guy like CJ Donaldson. And when they call themselves Sonic and Knuckles, you want to believe them. You think that that could be something they can be, like Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery at the Detroit Lions running back combo. I do think that their running back room has some excitement to it. I got another question coming in. This is actually from our forum. And it's an interesting question considering the narrative that surrounds both of these players, both who are inexperienced, but one comes with a reputation of legacy and one comes with a reputation as the number one overall prospect in his quarterback class. The question is, who has a better year as a first-year starter, Julian Sayin or Arch Manning?
That's a fun one. That's a fun one, because everybody's anointing Arch Manning already, but we haven't really seen him play. He's played a couple games when Quinn Ewers was hurt last year, but he hasn't played in a marquee game anything close to what he's going to be playing in 10 days from now at Ohio State. And so there's a lot of unknowns with both of these guys. I mean, with that being said, like, gun to my head, I have to pick one. I'm probably going to go with Arch Manning because of the fact that he has another year of experience. He's had 2 years at Texas under Steve Sarkisian to learn the offense, to acclimate. Who will be better by the end of their careers? I think that's a tougher question. But if I'm just going on this year, I'm going to go with Arch because he did play some last year. He did play in some high leverage situations last year, and he's got 2 years of experience under his belt, whereas Julian played very little last year, and he's been competing for the starting job all offseason. I mean, Arch knew from a moment last year. And Quinn Ewers could have said he was coming back to school and Arch Manning was going to be the starter this year. Like, that decision was made for Quinn Ewers. Like, you are not going to be the starter at Texas a year from now. That's why he entered the NFL draft. Like, Arch Manning was anointed to be the guy all year long. Julian had to earn it. So that's not to say that's a bad thing that Julian had to earn it. It's a good thing that Lincoln Keenel pushed him for that job. But I do think just based on the experience, based on the time that Arch has been there, and the fact that he's been that number one quarterback all off season long, I have to go Arch Manning.
This is the first time Dan and I are going to disagree on this live stream because I know Arch. I grant you has the experience advantage, has the even just not just in terms of how much he's played, but also he's in his third year. Julian's in his second. The reason I go Julian Sayin on that question is not because of the quarterbacks, it's because of the weapons. And I like Texas's best returning wide receiver is Ryan Wingo, who could be really good, had less than 500 yards last year. You have the best wide receiver in the country, Jeremiah Smith. You have one of the best Carnell Tate might be the best number 2 receiver in the country. Brandon Inniss might be the best number 3 receiver in the country. Max Clare, probably the best receiving tight end in the country. I think protection is the one question that you have a little bit. Sierveld sliding out to left tackle. Again, how confident Ohio State's been at him all offseason sparks confidence, but he's still got to go out and prove it after making that move against elite edge rushers, and then the right tackle competition as that's sorted out. Someone's won it. We don't know exactly who. We suspect Philip Daniels based on recent trends, but in any case, that pass protection is the one question I think you maybe feel a little more confident in Texas in that regard. Maybe,
but Texas is replacing 4 starters on its offensive line.
They are.
If I was taking an offensive line, I would take Ohio State's. Ohio State's got 4 guys on that offensive line who played major roles last year in the CFP. So personally,
that's true. I'll walk that back. I will also take Ohio State's offensive line. I'll walk that one back. To backpedal. So yes, the offense surrounding Julian Sayin is why I think Julian Sayin, I'll say it now, has a better year than Arch Manning.
I think too, something to consider in this question. This is a great question. I will say initially I was like Arch Manning 100%, but now I'm kind of starting to teeter a little bit on that line. Another thing I would offer
into
11
that Warriors poll question.
I know. I think something else to consider is Texas's schedule this year. It's no cakewalk for Arch Manning to be walking into his first season as Texas's starting quarterback. You start the season at Ohio State. Later in the year, you're going to be at Florida. You have a home game against Oklahoma. And then later you have a road game at Georgia and a home game against Texas A&M. Like, this is not an easy schedule for Arch Manning to navigate in his first season as a starting quarterback. You can look at Ohio State's schedule, but one of the things they have the benefit of is that they get to play Texas at home. I don't know how I would be feeling about this Ohio State-Texas matchup as a season opener if Ohio State had to travel to Austin. I do think Julian Sand is going to benefit in the season opener from having 105,000 fans riding behind him going into the season opener. I do think as well playing Penn State at home is a benefit. And a true test is going to be how he performs at the Big House in Ann Arbor. So the schedules also play a role in how you might answer this question, because with Arch Manning's weapons, are they going to be able to perform against some of those top-tier SEC teams that I mentioned? And is the offensive line going to be able to hold up against some of those top-tier SEC teams that I mentioned? So it's a great question. I thank you for submitting it. That was born and bred a Buckeye who asked that question in our forum. I got maybe time for one more question in here, and this will also be one that is Julian Sand related. This has been something of a trend that Ryan Day has gone through in his years whenever there's been a quarterback competition. He tends to wait a little bit into preseason camp to name his starting quarterback. Do you guys think that Ryan Day chose the appropriate time to name Julian Sand his starter? Or maybe did he wait too long? Or maybe did he go a little bit too early? What would you think of Ryan Day's timing in naming Sand the starting quarterback?
I think you got it right. I think, he allowed enough time for that competition to play out and for Julian to have to truly earn the job without letting it bleed so long into the real nitty gritty game prep for Texas. I think if it had been obvious coming out of spring, and I'm sure to some people it felt obvious, I don't think from Ohio State's perspective it was obvious. If it had been clear, like Julian's the guy, then I'd say he should have just named him at the end of spring. I think they really wanted to let that competition play out. I mean, I think for most of a spring until the spring game, Lincoln was outperforming Julian. Lincoln had a great summer, earned Iron Buckeye honors. So I think there was still very much a real competition hanging in the balance when preseason camp started. And that's why, they let that competition play out over 2.5 weeks of preseason camp. But we heard Ryan Day say it a couple weeks ago. By the end of last week, he wanted to know who his starter was. He did know who his starter was. He made that decision Monday. That gives them all of this week, all of next week, which is really when you start really focusing in on Texas. Those first couple weeks of camp, obviously there's going to be a little bit more focus on game one in preseason camp when you're playing Texas versus Akron. But those first couple weeks of preseason camp, they're still mainly about building up yourself, playing out those position battles, things like that. So I think it made sense to let them split the first team reps. You got to prepare Lincoln too, because you never know what will happen over the course of a year. So I think letting Lincoln get half those first team reps, letting that competition play out for, 2.5 weeks was smart. But I think Ryan Day knew going into this week, they had to name a starter, because I think if he didn't name a starter on Monday, you'd have a lot more concern, because it's like, okay, he can't make a decision. I mean, and we've seen it. It's only happened a couple times in recent history, but when Ohio State has let competitions play out into the season, it has not gone well. Kyle McCord, Devin Brown 2 years ago, they never found their rhythm as an offense after they let that competition play out into the season. Same thing 2015. Urban Meyer literally waited until the moment the game started to pick Cardale Jones as the starter, went back and forth all year. An offense that was loaded with talent just never found its rhythm that year. So I think it was important going into this week for Ryan Day to be decisive. And I think that's why he didn't even wait for a question to be asked. He walked right up to the podium on Monday and said, I'm not talking about Michigan, Julian Sand's starting quarterback. Like, he just get those two things out of the way. You knew those are going to be the first two questions you were going to be asked. So just get it out of the way. Julian's the guy. Move forward. Don't second guess that decision. So in my opinion, he got it just right.
Andy, I know you probably have wonderful thoughts on that question, but I'm going to fit in one more question from one of our viewers just to get this thing ended here. And it's from Matthew Jewell in our YouTube chat. He's curious, how much might Jelani Thurman see the field this season? Do you think that he could be used in the red zone? And then a question that he also has, if you could answer that one as well, is what might a Matt Patricia defense look like this season compared to last year's Knowles-led defense? Jelani Thurman first, and then the defense.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. Jelani, I think Jelani's a very interesting case, and it's a question I have myself about exactly how much he's going to see the field this year. Because I do think we've seen Jelani take real strides across his first 2 seasons at Ohio State, especially as a blocker. I think a lot of people remember that block on the goal line against Tennessee that led to a touchdown. And Jelani, the problem is there's 2 really good tight ends that figure to be above him on the depth chart. Max Clare and Will Kasmerick, who Keenan Bailey has called the best blocking tight end in the country. So how much does the third tight end get on the field for Ohio State? Are there packages? And I like the idea of red zone. I think Ohio State inside the 20-yard line might feel more confident rolling with 13 personnel. That's 1 running back, 3 tight ends, 1 wide receiver in those short yardage, in those red zone settings because of how deep the room is this year. They have so much good, talented, experienced players in that room, not just Will, Max, Jelani, but also Bennett Christian. Um, so getting those guys all action, because all 4 of them are good enough to be starters at Ohio State, I think, is a question they're going to have to solve. And I think Jelani could prove good enough to be the second tight end in a 12 personnel at certain spaces. Like, how much 12 personnel are they going to be using ultimately? Because you still have this awesome arsenal of wide receivers. Haven't even talked about Mylan Graham, who I think could have a really good year as a number 4 receiver, even for Ohio State. Some of the things we've seen from him this offseason. But I do think there will be an increase in reps from last year for Jelani, despite the addition of Max Clare. Just how much that is, unsure.
And then, Dan, how about you finish this out here? What do you think is going to be the primary difference? Almost just said defense. What do you think will be the primary difference between a Matt Patricia-led defense and a Jim Knowles-led defense for Ohio State in 2025?
Yeah, it's such a fascinating question. It kind of goes back to the fact, we only got to see those first 3 preseason practices where, like, I really feel like we go into a season like, I don't know what a Matt Patricia defense is going to look like. And I think that's a good thing for Ohio State because I think if you're Texas, you are not going to be able to know exactly what's coming from this Ohio State defense going into this first game. I mean, I watched the Patriots growing up a lot when Matt Patricia was there, and that defense could look very different from 1 week to the next. Now, I do think at Ohio State, you're not going to be able to change it up as much as you did in the pros because you've got guys who, you have limits in college on how many hours you can spend, with your players. These are also guys, they're young. A lot of these guys are inexperienced. I think you can ask Caleb Downs to do 15 different things and he'll be able to handle that just fine. You could probably ask Sonny Styles to do 15 different things and he can handle it just fine. Do you want to ask Arvell Reese and whoever the starting strong safety is and, all those guys to have to do 15 different things? Probably not. So I think there's some things that Matt Patricia is going to have to simplify a little more for Ohio State. And I also think, based on the way Ryan Day has consistently talked about the Matt Patricia hire, he has said several times, we wanted someone who would come in and run Ohio State's defense. We wanted someone who would come in and work well with Larry Johnson and Tim Walton and Matt Carreri and James Laurinaitis. So do I think Matt Patricia is going to come in and completely reinvent the wheel and this defense is going to look totally different than what it looked like last year? No, I think it's actually probably, when you talk about the differences, it's probably going to look more like the Ohio State defense we saw in the second half of last year and the first half of last year. And that's because the second half defense was kind of more what Ryan Day wanted the defense to be. And that's why Jim Knowles left for Penn State, because Ryan Day kind of took over after the Oregon game and said, we got to do some things differently on the defensive side of the ball than what you were doing in those first 6 games. We made some changes. Those changes worked. Ohio State's defense was the best in the country, and Ohio State won the national championship. I think a lot of the things that Ohio State did last year are going to continue to be components of this defense. I do think we're going to see more odd fronts than we did under Jim Knowles. And remember, Jim Knowles did want that to be a part of the defense at first, and then they just kind of utilized the wrong players. They were trying to make Jack Sawyer into a jack linebacker, and it just wasn't the right fit for him. I do think they have the personnel this year, whether it's a CJ Hicks, whether it's an Arvell Reese in a situational capacity. I think they have the personnel this year, kind of like Andy was talking about before, to do some creative things. I think they're going to have to do some creative things, especially on the defensive line, because they don't have a ton of defensive tackle depth. I think you're going to see more rushman packages, guys like Caden Curry, Bo Atkinson potentially sliding inside and doing some more of that inside rush stuff. I think we could see a little bit more mixing and matching in terms of secondary personnel where, in one situation you might have Lorenzo Styles playing nickel and Caleb playing free safety. Another situation, you may have Caleb playing nickel or playing linebacker and Malik Hartford and Jalen McClain both in there at safety. So I do think we're going to see a little more mixing and matching in terms of defensive lineups than we did a year ago. Maybe some more schematic shifting from week to week than we did a year ago. I do think that fundamentally it's still going to be a similar defense to what we've seen in the past. But again, it's like, we really don't know exactly what this defense is going to look like until the game actually starts at noon on August 30th. And that's a good thing for Ohio State because it makes it a lot harder for Texas to game plan for what exactly you're going to do.
Well, Dan, Andy, great observations. I learn something new every time I listen to you guys speak. I can confidently say the same is true for our audience. Well, this has been it for another episode of 11 Warriors Live. We covered a lot on today's episode, from our preseason camp standouts to some other observations to answering that Julian saying or Arch Manning, who's going to have the better season. And as we come to a wrap on this episode, we're going to move forward with some Texas-focused coverage in the week to come for what will be one of the greatest season openers, if not the greatest season opener of all time in college football. I've been Chase Brown, joined by Dan Hope and Andy Anders. Our coverage will continue on 11warriors.com, but it's been great to have you guys. Hope you have a great rest of your night.